Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cage Conversations podcast, the podcast where I play video games and yap for the enjoyment of my girlfriend. Today we are continuing to play Kingdom Hearts to continue to try and cheer ourselves up over the recent news that has come out with this whole Epstein business. But yeah, speaking of trying to, you know, find a light at the end of this tunnel, I want to talk about a video that I saw from Dreg. The video, like every other video that I mention, is going to be linked in the video so you can watch it. But essentially, Greg Guevara um, is a person who I like watching on YouTube, and I like his music as well. He has multiple channels, the Greg Guevara channel, the Dreg channel, JREG, and then Dread channel, JRED, right? And so one of the more interesting videos that I saw from him recently was him saying that we shouldn't imagine Sisyphus happy, right? Him making the argument for that. Before I get into what his argument was and what my counter argument is, want to get into what exactly is this even talking about, right? So the myth of Sisyphus, it's a ancient Greek myth. It's about this king who essentially wants to avoid dying, and so he tricks death when death comes to him, tricks death and seals him away for a period of time, but then uh, death escapes and uh, kills him. And then, for punishment for his crimes, he is forced forever to roll a boulder up a hill. But every time he gets close to getting it to the top of the hill, uh, it rolls back down. So he has to continue doing this forever. And it's essentially just a metaphor for saying, uh, the human desire to avoid death is a meaningless effort, just like rolling a boulder up a hill that always will eventually roll back down. That's essentially what the myth is about, right? And so in the 1900s, there was this philosopher, Jean Paul Sartre, and he is essentially one of the founders of existentialism, right? And so existentialism is essentially the belief that, our lives don't have an inherent meaning to them, right? We live in an indifferent universe, and we have to find a way to um, find our own meaning in life, right? He was pushing back on the idea that a lot of people have, that there's this grand plan for their life. There's this grand narrative. There's this thing that they're supposed to be doing, something that they're meant to do, and he's essentially saying that that is not true. You There is not some grand plan for your life. Is not There's nothing that's going to fully fulfill you, right? There's no point in your life where you're going to say, "Oh, I am like completely and utterly like this is what I'm supposed to be doing completely with my life. I'm like perfectly where I'm supposed to be." And you know, um, I think that is true, and I think that you look at the indifferent universe. No matter what plans you have for your life, anything can happen to us at any time, right? Any of us could be hit by a car and paralyzed, right? And through no fault of our own, we just happened to be out that day. There was a gas leak and there was an explosion and we died just randomly, right? Things happen and there's nothing to account for it. It's just a thing that happens to us and it's not fair, but it's also not unfair either. It's just how the world is, right? And so um thinking about that and thinking through the idea and the fact that like we don't have there's no grand arc or grand narrative of our life. And so, our quest for finding meaning in our lives, our quest for um achieving this uh contentedness, perfect contentedness, it is essentially the same as Sisyphus's quest, right? It's something that will never be fulfilled, and is utterly something that, we're going to keep trying for the rest of our lives. As part of what being alive is, trying to give our lives some kind of purpose, trying to reach this like state of being where we're quote unquote where we're supposed to be, but always failing because the universe does not have that for us. You can, you know, have whatever political or career goals that you may have, and you can work towards them, and maybe you'll achieve them, maybe you won't. But the universe doesn't have a grand plan to help you get there, right? And, you know, even if you did achieve your career goal, right, it doesn't mean that you will have achieved everything else. There's always going to be something that lacks. And even if you were to even come to a place where you were completely content and happy, it could all be taken away and at any moment, and it's very fleeting, right? And so this idea that we're going to eventually come to, I guess, the end of our story, happily ever after, again, it's not real. It is illusory, and the goal and the attempt to reach that is as meaningless and it's as meaningless and as fruitless as trying to avoid dying or trying to roll a boulder up a hill that will always roll back down, right? And but when Sartre said this, he also goes forward and says um that we must imagine that Sisyphus is happy, right? Even though he has to do this meaningless task forever and it causes him suffering, we have to imagine that Sisyphus is happy, right? And so this is what Dreg is responding to, right? And so Dreg essentially says that he doesn't think that we should imagine Sisyphus happy because doing so encourages us to not be honest about our suffering, right? The idea that if we are imagining Sisyphus happy, then we don't have to acknowledge the fact that he is suffering by having to roll his boulder up a hill forever and ever and ever, right? And how that applies to us again is we have to he interprets this as somehow he interprets this as Sartre saying that we have to um not be honest about the fact that we are suffering, right? Either in an existential way or in a very practical way as well. He also makes the point in the video that acknowledging that you're suffering and acknowledging that you're not happy uh, gives you the motivation to change your circumstances, right? Gives you the motivation to try and fix things. And so he argues that um, imagining Sisyphus happy and somehow us pretending to be happy within our suffering keeps us from having the motivation to change. And I would disagree. I disagree with Dreg's stance here. I think when I read that the one must imagine Sisyphus happy, I imagine that as Sisyphus as Sartre, I apologize, Sartre, saying that we have to have the motivation to find happiness while we are suffering, right? Um, and I just wanted to like elaborate on my thoughts about that. So, suffering, there's, a lot of suffering that we can go into, right? One, there's the universal suffering that we all deal with, the existential suffering that I talked about earlier, this never ending desire to keep on trying to achieve this perfect happily ever after for our lives and never being able to achieve it, right? So there's that kind of suffering that we exist under. There's also suffering that uh we exist under that is not necessarily universal, right? Suffering can come from our environment. I think through when I was a kid, right, and I would go to church. We had little bulletins, right? Yeah, itinerary of how the order of service was going to be, and I would check everything off as it happened because when I was a kid, this was like when I was in like middle school and like early high school, I would check things off as it happened because I was under the belief that if somebody came in here and shot up this church and all of us died, the police might want to know where we are in the service when it happened. Um, and that's not a normal thought, right? It's not a thought that anyone should have, let alone a child, but it is a thought that an American child that grows up in a world where mass shootings are very common, that's something that a child might think of, right? Might be wondering about. So and then there's the suffering that each of us have throughout our everyday lives, right? Maybe things suck at work. Maybe your car is busted, right? Maybe you're not getting paid as much as you deserve. Maybe you have a cold today, right? There's also that kind of suffering that we deal with on a individual basis. Um, and so, while we all have this suffering, I think through, right? And, I don't want to, I think people get into are hesitant to compare suffering or compare suffering of one person to another. But I do think that it is relevant, at least understanding what my argument is, right? And so, you know, uh, my suffering, whatever suffering that I am suffering from, currently, it could be worse, right? It could be a lot worse. And I think a good example of that is the suffering that the African slave, uh, uh, the ones that were enslaved in the Americas, what they suffered through, right? They had, like I said, the universal um, suffering that we all suffer from, right? And they also had the suffering that comes with being a person that is routinely forced into labor and raped and murdered and tortured, right? And so these people, they went through a great amount of suffering. And despite the suffering that they went through, somehow they were still able to find love, right? We know that African slaves got married, right? We know that they were able to find at least some slivers of happiness with each other. And the fact that they were able to find aspects of happiness does not mean that they weren't honest about their suffering, right? We have the Negro spirituals, we have, um, their songs of suffering, and it doesn't mean that they were not motivated to change their suffering, right? Because many slaves escaped, many revolted. There were a bunch of those things that happened, right? And so, looking at that, I think that, um, looking at the suffering in the life of an African slave, I think it's pretty proof positive that finding happiness while suffering is possible, right? And I look to that in times of sadness and despair, and I draw on the resilience and the strength of my ancestors to try and motivate me to find the happiness while I deal with the suffering that I deal with, right? And so, um, I think that there's a difference, right, between uh I think somebody is able to not be happy with a situation, but still not be miserable, right? Um, I think that doomerism is a choice. I think that despair is a choice. I think that, like I said, the idea that we'll ever any of us are going to be at a place where we're completely and perfectly happy and completely enjoying everything that's going on in our lives. I don't think that that is possible for any of us, right? Um, but that doesn't mean that you are sad forever, right? It doesn't mean that you are upset forever. It means that you have to find a way to continue to have hope. Yeah, it means you have to find a way to continue to find happiness and things to enjoy about the life that you are living. Um, no matter how much suffering is inside of the life that you are living, there are things you should be able to find things that you can be happy about, even if you are rolling a boulder up a hill forever and it always rolls back down. You have to do it again. You have to find a way to find a happiness in that. Find something to enjoy, right? Um, I giving it a more practical example, moving from the African slave analogy to the uh, I guess the current one that's more prescient, right, or more, current, even though this is something that all of us have dealt with forever, right? The death of a parent, right? Does how does what I'm saying apply to a situation like that? Something that most of us will have to deal with at some point in our lives, and right, I'm not saying that a person shouldn't be grieving and mourning. Obviously, they should. That is a very natural and human reaction to something um, that something that is traumatic, and you might always be grieving and mourning. Right? That might be something a suffering that you have for you for the rest of your life. The fact that you lose your mom. Um, and but there's two options, right, to what to do with that despair, right? You can, you know, um, fall into addiction to try and numb that pain. You can try and end that pain through committing harm against yourself, violence against yourself, or you can try and find the happiness within it, right? Yeah, your um, mom might be dead, but you are happy that your family is there to support you, right? And there's something to be happy about in that situation. That's part of that's part of um that's part of the funeral process, right? There's a reason why we don't all mourn our loved ones individually. We mourn them together because there's a there's a positive aspect to the fact that you don't have to go through this alone, right? I think a lot of people might listen to this and say what I'm talking about is cope. Is talking about coping. I think a lot of people are, I think a lot of people online are worried about people coping with bad situations and like that kind of thing. And I think, at least for me, I think a cope is a self delusion, right? Someone trying to say that they're actually not suffering when they are, right? This would be someone saying, "I like rolling this boulder uphill." That's what Sisyphus would say if he was coping, right? Um, a different version of cope, right, would be saying that I'm glad my mom is dead, right? Unless you have a relationship like Jeanette McCurdy or something like that, that is something that is that would be a cope if your mom died and you said that, right? To mask the fact that you are suffering and to ignore that suffering, right? Or, depending on your beliefs, right? Someone could say that the belief that you will see your deceased loved one again in the afterlife is a cope, right? It's a idea that it's not that bad because I'll see them again. And people would argue, those that don't believe in an afterlife would argue that that is a cope, right? You're self deluding yourself by saying that. And I think that uh, what I'm talking about, what I believe Sartre is talking about the finding happiness, I think that that is not a cope, right? It's what I believe is being said here, what I think that we need to make efforts to do is say, like, I am suffering, I'm acknowledging my suffering and X, right? So the existential suffering that we all deal with, right? It is the acknowledgement is, I'm going to die and everything that I do is going to ultimately amount to nothing in the grand scheme of the universe. That is the the fact of the suffering that we deal with. But we can also say, I enjoy the life that I'm living now, right? That is the dichotomy that I think Sartre is talking about, right? I I do know, it is, you know, distressing to a point that, we are going to die and everything that we do is going to ultimately mean nothing. But it's also something that we need to acknowledge that, we can also still enjoy life, right? We can still enjoy being around the people and enjoy things about our life so that not that we are ignoring the fact that we're going to die and our lives are meaningless, but while we're here we might as well enjoy it. um Another example, um I'm very pessimistic about the future. Watching Dreg's videos seems like he is also pessimistic about the future. And that could be, the acknowledgement of suffering would be the future is bad. You couple that with, but my present is good. If it is, I would say that, yeah, I'm pessimistic about the future, but right now, I think that my life is pretty good right now, right? And I'm enjoying the life that I have right now. People, I would say that, with the whole political situation that we're dealing with now, the political suffering that a lot of us are dealing with is, the fact that Trump is in office and that he is an autocrat, right? And the um, happiness that we can find within it is the fact that more and more people every day seem to be turning away from this um, MAGA cult, and they're realizing what this authoritarian regime is and trying to resist against it, right? That is, both those things are happening. It is, you know, difficult and it's painful to think that, we've been dealing with this guy for 10 years now, and some people are just now coming to the realization of what is happening in this country. But um, the fact that the fact that people are realizing what's happening in this country, that is something to be happy about. I think it is a small happiness, but it is something to be happy about. Additionally, the thing that I said earlier, right? My mother is dead. That is an acknowledgement of the suffering that I'm dealing with. But the finding happiness within it would be, I'm glad that my girlfriend was there with me while I was going through that troubling time. So, um, that's, essentially, I do agree that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Um, one has to imagine being able to find happiness while they suffer. I don't think that this happiness should in any way convince you to stop trying to end your suffering, to stop getting you to try, or should in any way stop you from being honest about the suffering that you're experiencing. I talk a lot of my videos so far have been talking about like the need for people to start building communities and that kind of thing. And I think that, you only are able to do that if you're emotionally honest, right? You can't build a community around you if you're not able to be sincere with people. So yeah, you do need to be able to acknowledge the suffering that you have, the suffering that you're dealing with, and you have to be willing to try and fix it, right? Um, you know, that is something that you have to be able to do, but you also have to be able to not be miserable, right? Because the that is the sickness, right? That is the disease. That is the pain point. If you succumb to the sickness, if you succumb to misery, if you succumb to the idea that things aren't that I'm just going to suffer and there's nothing that I can do about it and I can't find any happiness in it. Well, if you can't find any happiness in it, right? Um then you're in a situation where um like I said, you're doomer, right? You're doomer. You're just miserable, and I think that is a bigger barrier to trying to fix your situation, right? If you believe that there's nothing that brings you happiness while you're in this life, while you're suffering, then what would be the motivation to make things better, right? You can't even imagine things being better at that point because things are so bad, right? So, I think that being able to acknowledge positive aspects of your lives and saying, I want to make the world, I want to make myself more in line with the positive aspects that I see, I think that that is important. I think another caution that I would say is I think that there is, another side to this coin, right? The desire to, or the pursuit of happiness, right? This pursuit of happiness, what does it, what exactly works, right? When you say that you have this suffering, but you have this thing that brings you happiness, what is it? Are all things that bring you happiness valid? I would say no, right? Someone that says, I I have these bad things that are going on in my life, my existential suffering, my loneliness, all these kind of things, any kind of suffering that they're dealing with, and they say, but at least I can still goon, at least I can still watch Netflix, at least I can still go on 4chan, those kinds of things. I think that when we like those things are not um valid aspects of valid interpretations of the happiness that I think that Sartre is talking about, or at least what I think should be the happiness that assuages our suffering, right? Because I would say that a lot of those things, right, they're not actually um something that assuages our suffering, right? Gooning and just doom scrolling Twitter and watching Netflix all the time, those things aren't bringing you happiness. They're essentially a cope, right? They're self delusion. They distract you from the suffering that you're dealing with, right? That is not the same as being honest about the suffering and finding something positive in spite of that suffering, right? When you are, just endlessly watching Netflix, you're not thinking about the suffering that you experience, you're you're distracting yourself from it. Again, it's a delusion that they want to create for us. The Epstein class of this country, the political and economic elite, they want to distract us from our suffering so that they can inflict more suffering on us so that things can be worse and they can continue to profit off of it. So I would say that um, the these things, a lot of things that they have created for our society, for us, like I said, gooning, endless content, social media, online quote unquote friends, these things are a distraction from your suffering. The real, what we're talking about, right? If when your girlfriend or your family is there for you, when your father passes away, that's not, um, they're not there to distract you from the fact that your mom died. They're there to support you during this difficult time, right? That is something different. Um, the fact, no slave that got married and fell in love and whatnot, none of them were ever deluded or confused about or forgot the fact that they were enslaved. Um, Same thing with any other suffering that we have, right? Where I talked about the happiness that you can achieve, right? The happiness that you can find. The fact that I enjoy my life that I'm living now is not supposed to be used to distract myself from the fact that I am going to die and my life will amount to nothing, right? That is those two things. The fact that I'm enjoying my life now does not in any way negate that or distract me from that fact. Um, Gooning does distract you from that fact, right? At least temporarily. But that is, I think that is a situation that that we're in, right? You know, the these things that I'm talking about, they they distract you and they also don't do anything to help you change your circumstances. Um, they don't help you in any way change the fact that you are suffering. You're not going to goon enough to the fact that you're no longer sad that your mom is dead. You can just keep doing it to distract you from the fact that your mom is dead, but that's never going to stop the grieving process. So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point clear that I think that there are good and bad aspects of uh, seeking happiness, and I think that there are good and bad aspects of it. There are valid and invalid aspects of it, and I think that we there's no reason to conflate the two into saying that they are somehow the same, right? If you're trying to find what is a good version of happiness that you can look to, again, lastly, I would just say that it is one that doesn't distract you from the suffering, but is uh, there to support you through that suffering or alleviate the pain of that suffering in some way, or it is something that helps you to fix that suffering or make it less so and change it in some way. If it's not one of those things, then then it is actually a cope. Then it is actually a self-deluding idea that you need to excise yourself of. But yeah, that is everything. A little bit shorter today. But yeah, if you're my girlfriend, I love you. Next time I see you, please let me know what you think about this video. If you're not my girlfriend, please like, comment, and subscribe, and try and make the world a better place. Thank you, and bye. P.S. I just want to say that obviously not all forms of trying to distract yourself from your suffering is bad. I think that there is a time and place for it. Obviously, I am playing Kingdom Hearts right now, a comfort game in these weird and trying times. But you know, I think that that is okay. It just cannot be the only thing that you do with your suffering, and you need to find other ways to move past to find the happiness within it. I am still looking for what kind of happiness can possibly come out of this situation. But yeah, um, I don't want to give the delusion that this is an easy process. It's just a process that I think that we should all engage in. But that is that is the final aspect. Goodbye.